part two, I'm going to focus more on the empirical study that I did on hipsters and bogans, looking at examples of it in comedy and in news. And so, yeah, as I said, I was kind of doing this research in between about 2015 and 2017, 18-ish. And at the time, the terms hipster or bogan were used a hell of a lot in the media, in news stories, in opinion pieces, in comedy. People were using them quite a lot and still use bogan quite a lot, making comments about people under stories or on Facebook or whatever. So, I mean, there was some kind of magazine somewhere named Newcastle, kind of top 5 hipster destination in the world, which is interesting in many ways. I think it was probably connected to some kind of tourism effort. But as you probably well know, it's kind of referred to as a kind of bogan town a lot as well, where the kind of more hipster kids move to Melbourne. Another interesting example to think about these terminologies and figures is around the incredible art gallery in Hobart made by David Walsh, Mona. And all the stories around it, like around this time, it had been open for a few years and there was kind of a lot of attention being paid to it. And sometimes, it was kind of described as a hipster's Disneyland, particularly around the kind of festivals that happen in the winter and summer there around the gallery. But then the more kind of discerning, traditional art critic started to kind of think about whether this was art for bogans. And the reasons for that is rather than just going into the art gallery and kind of just looking at the art and kind of, using your knowledge to come up with like various analyses and thoughts and feelings. At Mona, you get an iPod or some kind of device that you can go up to the artwork and it kind of tells you a bunch of things about it. And like, the high cultural capital, more snobby end of the art critique didn't see that as an appropriate thing. And like, you should actually just know this stuff and be able to appreciate the art without, being told stories about it or whatever. Similar thing with like David Walsh, the figure of the David Walsh. He was kind of often referred to as a hipster millionaire. At the same time in Newcastle, we had Nathan Tinkler, who owned the Knights at the time, that was described as a bogan billionaire. And you can see there that kind of seems a contradiction in terms in many ways. The bogan, this kind of culturally uncouth, kind of vulgar, bad taste person being a billionaire. You can see how economic and cultural capital there are kind of quite divided. So I use this kind of what's called a figurative method, where I kind of drew on these kind of terminologies to think about what kind of work they're doing. What are the effects of how these things are talked about and represented and misrepresented, those kind of things. Particularly inspired by the work of Imogen Tyler, whose really awesome book, I highly recommend it, called Revolting Subjects, is a really good an analysis of the way certain figures in the UK, like such as asylum seekers and poor people, and particularly single mother poor people, are kind of used in the media in these really kind of denigrating ways to kind of really kind of justify various public policies and kind of blame, scapegoat, groups of people for broader social problems and economic problems that they obviously have no impact or social control over. So I highly recommend that book. And in that, she kind of talks about how these figures are used and positioned politically to engender revulsion out of the population, to kind of manipulate the population to be angry or concerned about various things. The analysis I'm doing is not kind of that kind of overtly political in that sense. And I would say that the hipster and bogan are kind of more playful figures in many ways, although the bogan is used quite a little bit more kind of insultingly. It is also used quite playfully as well, much more so than the UK version of the chat. And as I kind of mentioned already, when I'm using the terms hipster and bogan here, I'm actually talking about real people. I'm really talking about the way that they're kind of figurative nodes in a way for a bunch of taste and morals to be kind of configured around. So they're devices in a way for people to talk about others, but also position themselves. So I kind of, looked through hundreds, if not thousands of examples of the way that these different terminologies were used and figured, and you can kind of link to some stuff there. One of the kind of different character archetypes of the bogan is that they're racist. And one of the archetypes of the hipster is they're kind of more progressive in many senses, but also in a lot of their social communication, their consumption, and the different way they express things are open to what's called hipster sexism and hipster racism, where there's this notion that they're kind of so educated and know so much about these things, you can kind of ironically make sexist and racist jokes. And therefore, it's not sexist or racist because, I know about this stuff. I'm just being ironic. Obviously, if you're making those sexist and racist jokes, you're just being sexist and racist. So there was a kind of some really interesting analysis around those kind of things. Much of the discussion about the hipster was a kind of lens into consumer culture, about particularly the kind of overload of irony, and particularly debates about what's authentic and what's not. So again, there's a bunch of things there, and there was kind of some stuff that I'll talk about in future weeks about Dole Wave, a kind of particular genre in Australia of kind of underground indie music, where there was kind of positioning about whether it's hipster or bogan and all this kind of stuff. So what's interesting about the hipster examples, it kind of more so elicited debates and conversations about things. The bogan, though, is generally used much more as a kind of pejorative. Again, I've got a bunch of examples there. Their McMansions, their gas guzzling kind of trucks, and all this kind of stuff. The bogan's seen much more of a threat. The hipster's kind of a consumer clown that we can kind of critique for various absurdities and hypocrisies, where the bogan is positioned much more of a threat physically in terms of being racist and violent, but a threat to kind of the tasteful culture as well. So you can see here the different work the figures do. It kind of corresponds to who's writing, who's saying stuff, but they do map on in that sense, loosely, therefore, to class cultures. The hipster is much more representative kind of middle class culture. The bogan, obviously, much more attached to working class culture. So when it comes to hipster and bogan parody, again, there's links there. Hopefully they still all work. I should have probably checked that before I put them up. I'll fix them up if they don't. And stuff, there was like Stuff White People Like was a blog in the US turned into a book where it was kind of this parody of, it was really kind of stuff white hipster people like, and it kind of was written in this kind of pseudo anthropology kind of ethnographic voice. Kind of like if you've never met a white person before, these are the things you could talk about or bring up to kind of make them like you. This was copied in Australia to a kind of much more pejorative and much more insulting things bogans like. Again, it was turned into a book. And the examples there are kind of quite representative of what's going on here. Again, the hipster thing is more playful. The bogan's much more pejorative. And there's specific reasons for that I'll get into in a sec. Portlandia is a good example of kind of a hipster parody that kind of put a burn on it kind of stuff. Bondi hipsters in Australia, pretty straightforward. This goes back to kind of a thing in the 90s. Nathan Barley's an example of this kind of proto-hipster figure. There's some other examples there of the hipster games and the bedroom philosopher. On the bogan side of things, there's quite a bit of stuff in Australia, TV shows that kind of, if not a kind of about, in inverted commas, the bogan, use kind of bogan-esque kind of critique or parody or satire to do the comedy. So Bogan Pride and Housos are obvious ones. Kind of overt satire and parody about those things. Not necessarily all pejorative, sometimes a little bit playful, sometimes a little bit celebratory. Kath and Kim's an interesting one because they're kind of suburban, cashed up bogans in a way. But there's a lot, much of the comedy there is about the mispronunciation of words, the kind of daggy tastes and that kind of thing. Not as vulgar as a kind of Houso Bogan Pride thing, but still kind of bogan-esque kind of satire there going on. And what I think is an interesting one is Upper Middle Bogan, which is kind of what I've described as a kind of more equal opportunity parody and satire that kind of, in the title, it seems to be more focused upon the bogan, but much of the parody and satire in that is of the upper middle class as well. So class here is a kind of key motor of comedy, just like often like, you know, gender and race and stuff is, it often can be quite problematic. You'll see that kind of when there's jokes, racist and sexist jokes, there tends to be much more uprising and offense about those things, and rightly so, but not so much about class. Like it seems to be those lower in the social stratum, in terms of economics and in terms of taste, seems to be much more acceptable to kind of take the piss out of them. So again, I'm pointing out here that the hipster and bogan, these figures are used in quite similar ways to kind of create comedy, satire, but they represent and they kind of do different things. So what does this all mean? I think particularly when it comes to the humor, there's a lot of great philosophical kind of conceptual understandings of humor, and there's an increasing kind of sociology of comedy that's really interesting if you want to check some of that stuff out. But like to be quite general here, I suppose Simon Critchley's very small book about comedy is worth checking out. I think it's called On Humor. And he argues that there's kind of three broad areas at how humor works. Superiority theory, which is essentially, you know, your sexist, classed, racist, ethnocentric kind of jokes, but also that kind of Schadenfreude kind of joke, kind of laughing at the expense of others. There's relief theory, which is kind of how comedy can kind of release this kind of nervous pent-up energy where we kind of take pleasure over our oppression. And there's incongruity theory, kind of, which is juxtaposing kind of things absurdly, I suppose, that what takes place in the joke. So if you're interested in that, like check out that book. It uses some interesting examples, and I think I kind of use some examples in the reading this week as well. Importantly, though, Critchley argues that much comedy reinforces social hierarchies and power. While there kind of are instances of kind of critique of power comedy, much of the stuff that appears in kind of the mainstream public realm is really what he calls reactionary and comedies of recognition. So I won't read those quotes there too much, but I would say that that's kind of quite true in terms of the hipster and bogan stuff. I think most of it appears in the kind of superiority theory part, but it's kind of different depending on which one. As I'll kind of talk about in detail in the next section, the hipster is kind of used more jokingly and humorously and kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink, kind of hipsters are kind of consumer clown, because it's a much more middle class culture, and the people making all this stuff, you know, writing opinion pieces, writing the news, making comedy shows tend to be middle class. The bogan stuff tends to be more pejorative because it's middle class people relating to people that aren't like them. So there's a kind of interesting homology that goes on in terms of social distance and social gravity that I'll talk about more in the next section.